Henry Hodges was a farmer residing roughly 6 miles from Statesboro, the county seat of Bullock County, Georgia. On the night of Thursday, July 28, 1904, a fire consumed his farmhouse. The following day, the remains of Hodges, his wife Claudia, their 9-year-old daughter Kitty Corin, 2-year-old son Harmon, and 6-month-old son Talmadge were discovered in the ruins. The 5 family members were interred together in a single coffin the next day. Even while the house burned, neighbors who arrived at the scene noticed signs of a struggle nearby. Hodges' hat, bloodstains, and evidence of a scuffle. By morning, they found the footprints of 4 men around the house, one appearing to be barefoot. Tracking dogs were brought in, but could not follow the trail far. Nearby, 2 shoes were discovered, a brogan and a dress shoe, both reportedly belonging to Paul Reed, an African-American tenant on a local farm. A knife identified as Reed's was also found nearby, along with strands of hair thought to be from Claudia Hodges, caught in tar on one of the shoes. The next day, an unofficial posse from the area searched Reed's home, uncovering shoes that matched those found at the Hodges house, with one inside Reed's home and the other beneath it. Laces on the shoes, cut from calico fabric, matched materials found in Reed's home. They also found a pair of pants with apparent bloodstains in the pocket. While Reed admitted the shoes were his, he claimed the blood came from a partridge he had carried and denied involvement in the Hodges family's death. Despite his denial, the sheriff arrested both Paul Reed and his wife, Harriet. While in custody, Harriet Reed provided a statement to the sheriff. Though her account contained inconsistencies and some unconfirmed claims, she implicated her husband, Paul Reed, and a neighbor, Will Cato, in the murders of the Hodges family. According to Harriet, her husband and Cato believed that Henry Hodges had hidden money behind his chicken coop. The 2 men had initially gone to the Hodges' property the previous Saturday night to dig up the money, but were discovered. They managed to convince Hodges they were just passing by en route to a store, with Cato explaining that he'd been grazed by a snake and was searching for turpentine to treat the wound. Harriet claimed that Reed and Cato returned to the Hodges' farm on Thursday night to make another attempt at finding the hidden money. Once again, they were caught, and a struggle ensued. When Hodges' wife, Claudia, attempted to help her husband, both she and Henry were killed. Reed and Cato then moved their bodies into the house before fleeing the scene. Later that night, they returned, planning to search the house for money and set it ablaze to cover up the crime. During this second visit, they found 9-year-old Kitty Corin hiding inside. Despite her pleas for mercy, offering them a nickel to spare her, Reed and Cato killed her. They then spread kerosene throughout the house, setting it on fire, and left the 2 young boys inside to perish in the flames. News of Harriet Reed's confession quickly spread, fueling tension in the community. While 15 African American men were brought in for questioning, public suspicion fixated on Reed and Cato. Local newspapers, including the Savannah Morning News and the Augusta Chronicle, published sensationalized stories suggesting that the discovery of coins and a gold ring near Claudia Hodges' body ruled out robbery as the motive. Instead, the papers insinuated more sinister acts, claiming that the flames concealed a darker crime, and hinting that both Claudia and her daughter Kitty Corin had been assaulted, stoking racial fears. These implications played into widespread Southern stereotypes, where African American men were vilified as a threat to white women, a narrative used to justify Jim Crow laws and lynching as supposed protection measures. Ray Stannard Baker, a Northern journalist covering the case, noted the racial attitude in Bullock County, where white residents distinguished between self-respecting resident black folk and worthless black folk. He observed that many white men in the county believed it unsafe for female family members to travel alone or to be outside after dark. Reed and Cato had both been involved in the turpentine industry, a significant employer in Bullock County. Although Reed was a tenant farmer and Cato a laborer at the time, both had previously worked in local turpentine camps. The seasonal labor demands in these camps attracted young African American men from outside the county, which led to racialized perceptions of itinerant workers as shiftless and disruptive by local white residents. The Statesboro News wrote that the good farmers of Bullock County were awakened by the Hodges family murders to the fact that they were living in constant danger, describing itinerant workers as human vampires ready to wreak havoc. While Reed was a native of Bullock County, Cato had come from South Carolina, initially drawn to the area by work opportunities in the turpentine camps. In Statesboro, rumors of lynching Reed and Cato began circulating, prompting the sheriff to transfer them to the jail in Savannah for safety. After arriving in Savannah, Reed initially confessed to acting as a lookout for John Hall and Sank Tolbert, both employees of a local company in Statesboro. He claimed that Hall had orchestrated the robbery and murders, and that Cato had not been involved. However, after a few days, Reed changed his story, saying once again he had been a lookout, but now implicating Will Rainey and Cato as the perpetrators. Reed later introduced a new accusation blaming the crimes on a so-called Before Day Club, an alleged secret group of African Americans intent on robbing and killing white residents. This time, he claimed that he and Cato were responsible for the crime, with Dan Young acting as a lookout. At trial, Reed's story shifted again. He stated he had served as a lookout while the murders were carried out by Cato, Hall, Rainey, Handy Bell, and a person he referred to as the Kid. All individuals named by Reed were subsequently arrested. News of Reed's claims about the Before Day Club quickly spread, and reports of similar clubs emerged in other parts of Georgia, as well as Alabama and Virginia. However, as the initial fervor died down, the Statesboro News later admitted that these clubs probably don't exist. A coroner's jury convened on August 1st and 2nd, gathering testimony from Harriet Reed, Ophelia Cato, and neighbors who had aided in the investigation. Based on the evidence presented, the jury indicted Paul Reed and Will Cato, though most other suspects were released. Harriet Reed, Ophelia Cato, and Handy Bell were held as witnesses, though many in the white community believed Bell should have also been indicted. In response to public calls for a swift trial, Superior Court Judge Alexander Daly scheduled the trial for August 15, 1904. Separate trials were arranged so that Harriet Reed could testify against Cato and Ophelia Cato against Reed. The community's demand for lynching Reed and Cato intensified, with rumors suggesting they would have already been lynched had they not been moved to Savannah. Telegrams even arrived from neighboring counties offering assistance in lynching the men. The Statesboro News openly advocated for their public hanging, while a local photography studio advertised photos of the murdered Hodges family. Special excursion fares on the Savannah and Statesboro Railway were offered for those wishing to attend the trial. With tension rising, Statesboro Mayor George M. Johnson contacted Georgia Governor Joseph M. Terrell to request militia support to prevent a lynching. The governor dispatched the Savannah-based Oglethorpe Light Infantry of the 1st Infantry Regiment, Georgia State Troops, under Captain Robert M. Hitch. Captain Hitch also assumed command of a Statesboro militia company, bringing his force to 115 men. The troops arrived in Statesboro on the morning of August 15th. Cato's trial commenced that afternoon, with the militia escorting both men to the Bullock County Courthouse. Though Cato was on trial, much of the testimony focused on Reed's role in the crime. Cato denied involvement, testifying that Reed and 3 other men had told him of a plan to rob Hodges, which he claimed to have refused. After just 8 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Cato guilty, and the militia returned him and Reed to the jail. That night, as the militia guarded the jail, groups of men, some intoxicated, roamed the town and even called unsuccessfully for Judge Daly to address them. The next morning, the militia again escorted Reed and Cato to the courthouse for Reed's trial. Reed claimed he had lent his shoes, found at the Hodges' farm, to another member of the so-called Before Day Club. He admitted to standing watch while others went to rob Hodges, but said he fled and hid when he heard the murders. The jury swiftly found him guilty. Judge Daly sentenced both Reed and Cato to be hanged on September 9th. Newspapers had predicted that Reed and Cato would be lynched as soon as their trials concluded. However, the crowd in the courtroom and around the courthouse was smaller during Reed's trial than it had been the previous day for Cato's. This led court officials to believe that the threat of lynching was diminished, though they still planned to transfer the convicted men to Savannah for safety. Before they could be moved, however, a crowd gathered outside on the ground floor of the courthouse. Captain Hitch assigned half his militia force to guard the staircase leading to the courtroom on the second floor. Captain Hitch, Judge Daly, Mayor Johnson, the sheriff, and Reverend Harmon Hodges, the brother of victim Henry Hodges, tried to address the mob, but their efforts were drowned out by shouts. Communication with Savannah was cut off as the telephone lines had been severed. As the crowd surged, some even brought ladders to reach the second floor. The militia, who had been ordered not to load their weapons, attempted to hold the line, but some were disarmed by the mob. In the chaos, a man said to be either a bailiff or deputy sheriff reportedly seized Captain Hitch and threw him into the mob, which then pulled him away from the courthouse. The remaining militia allowed the mob to reach the second floor, where the sheriff unlocked the room holding Reed and Cato and pointed them out to the crowd. The mob placed ropes around their necks, loaded them into wagons, and left the courthouse. Estimates of the crowd size range from 100 to 2,500 people. The mob intended to lynch Reed and Cato at the Hodges' farm, approximately 6 miles from town, but due to the intense August heat, they stopped after traveling about 1 mile. Although initial plans were to hang the men, the mob demanded they be burned instead. Wagons were sent back to town to gather kerosene and chains. While waiting, Paul Reed reportedly confessed to killing Henry and Claudia Hodges and leaving the children to burn alive, claiming Cato had served as lookout and naming additional accomplices. Cato, meanwhile, was unable to speak coherently. Once the kerosene and chains arrived, Reed and Cato were chained to a tall pine stump and doused with 10 gallons of kerosene each. Wood was piled at their feet, and a photographer recorded the scene. Cato begged to be shot or hanged, but the mob insisted on burning him alive, lighting the pyre and tending it until their bodies were fully consumed. Chains, pieces of burned stump, and even fragments of bone were taken as souvenirs. Photos of Reed and Cato chained to the stump, of their burning bodies, and of the charred remains were later sold. On Thursday, August 14, 1913, 2 Croatian-American miners on strike, Ivan Kalin and Ivan Stimac, traveled to South Range, Michigan, with a group of fellow strikers to collect strike benefits. Upon arrival, they discovered that the Western Federation of Miners was unable to provide funds due to the scale of the strike. After stopping for a drink, the 2 men began their journey back to their boarding house in Seberville. As they passed through Painesdale, Kalin and Stimac briefly separated from their group to purchase soda pop at a local store. Once finished, they continued their trek, taking a shortcut across mining company property. During this final leg of their journey, they were confronted by Humphrey Quick, a trammer boss assigned to patrol the property by his supervisor, William H. Schatz. Quick shouted at them, warning they were not permitted to use the path. However, Kalin and Stimac, limited in their English proficiency, did not fully understand the warning. Kalin, speaking in broken English, explained they had always used the path before. Frustrated, Quick brandished a billy club, threatening them if they did not comply. Despite his threats, the 2 men continued walking. Quick later claimed that Kalin turned back and shook his fist, shouting, "You better watch out, you son of a bit. I fixed you for sure," as they walked away. By then, Kalin and Stimac were about 100 feet away and soon disappeared towards Seberville. Quick reported the incident to his supervisor, Satch, while en route encountering Thomas Raleigh, a violent strikebreaker. Excited by Quick's story, Raleigh urged him to seek Satch's permission to confront the miners. Upon hearing Quick's account, Satch recognized the situation as a potential misunderstanding due to the language barrier. He instructed Quick and Raleigh to retrieve Kalin and Stimac, emphasizing, "Bring them down here, and I'll talk to them." Quick and Raleigh set off for Seberville, joined along the way by several others, including deputized strikebreakers from the Waddell Mahone Agency and local non-striking residents. When the mob arrived at the boarding house, Thomas Raleigh asked Humphrey Quick to identify Ivan Kalin. Quick spotted Kalin, standing near a group of men playing a lawn bowling game in the side yard of the Putridge boarding house. Kalin, who had just finished dinner, was outside chewing tobacco and was not participating in the game. Several neighbors were also present. Raleigh shouted at Kalin, "I want you," to which Kalin replied, "No, you can't take me." The strikebreakers, armed with billy clubs, began assaulting Kalin and others nearby. Kalin managed to escape into the boarding house, while his companion, Ivan Stimac, remained inside, finishing his supper. Amid the chaos, Harry James climbed over the fence as the violence unfolded. The landlord, Joseph Putrich, tried to de-escalate the situation, telling the armed men, "I don't want any trouble around my house." During the commotion, Stephen Putrich, Joseph's brother, came outside. A thrown object, which missed its target, startled one of the armed men, Cooper, who was already holding a firearm. Isolated and outnumbered in the yard, while the other gunmen stood outside the fence, Cooper panicked when a stick struck his head. In his fear, he fired his gun at the first person he saw, fatally shooting Stephen Putrich in the abdomen. Stephen had no connection to the earlier incident on the trail, but became an unintended victim. The other gunmen reacted by rushing back into the yard, surrounding the boarding house, and firing their weapons indiscriminately into it. Inside, Joseph Putrich's wife, Antonia, grabbed their 7-month-old daughter and fled through the kitchen, narrowly avoiding gunfire. As she leapt from a shed to escape, the baby's face was burned by powder from a close-range gunshot. Meanwhile, her 3- and 4-year-old children remained trapped in the dining room. Cooper pursued Kaylin into the house, firing as he went. The hired girl, Josephine Grubtick, abandoned her dishwashing and ran through the smoke-filled house to the master bedroom. Amid the gunfire, boarder Albert Tejan witnessed the chaos. He saw men with guns at the windows, and Josephine fleeing with the children. Upstairs, Albert encountered his 18-year-old brother Aloys, who collapsed in his arms, saying, "Brother, they killed me." Aloys had been shot in the side and soon died. Elsewhere in the house, Stanko Stepik lay at the bottom of a staircase, mortally wounded. Shot in the arm and back, he attempted to climb the stairs on his hands and knees, but collapsed. Stephen Putrich, bleeding from his stomach wound, cried out to his brother, Joseph, who rushed to call a doctor. Despite his efforts, Stephen succumbed to his injuries the following day at the Mine Hospital in Tri-Mountain. His death certificate uniquely recorded the cause as homicidal, a rare designation during the 1913 strike violence. As the shooting subsided, Ivan Stymack fled from the boarding house, injured by a gunshot to his side. He stumbled over Stipich's body and witnessed the dying Tejan brothers before grabbing his coat and escaping into the woods. He hid until nightfall and sought refuge with a friend, Frank Stiglich. The doctor who arrived later found little he could do. Aloy Tejan was beyond saving, and Stephen Putrich's injuries were too severe for treatment at his house. Though rushed to the hospital, Stephen passed away the next day. The violence at Seberville became another tragic episode in the 1913 miners' strike, underscoring the brutal conflicts and losses endured by the strikers and their families. Once the group ran out of ammunition, they began altering the crime scene to fabricate evidence suggesting the conflict had been two-sided. According to Stephen Leto, after the gunmen who had fired their guns ran out of ammunition, they paused and walked out to the road in front of the house. Several witnesses would later testify that they saw the gunmen casually walk out to the road, reload their guns just in case they needed to do some more shooting, and then start gathering rocks, bottles, and sticks to throw into the yard. Leto argues that a legitimate police officer would have preserved the crime scene for investigation rather than planting evidence to shift blame. The gunmen also dumped spent shell casings into the dirt instead of preserving them as evidence. Children later found and collected the shells. Leto highlights this as further proof that the gunmen were trying to cover their tracks, aware that the physical evidence painted them in a negative light. Following the shooting, Thomas Raleigh and the other gunmen nonchalantly left the scene without calling the police or seeking medical help for the injured. After walking some distance, they realized the need to address the situation and returned to the boarding house, still posing as law enforcement. Without notifying a sheriff or doctor, they entered the house with guns drawn, demanding the boarders hand over any weapons. Despite the boarders' insistence that no weapons were present, Raleigh and his men conducted a thorough search, tearing the house apart. They found no weapons. As the gunmen ransacked the boarding house, neighbors began arriving to assist the victims. This development alarmed the gunmen, as the witnesses threatened to expose the truth of the incident. Peter Klobacher, a neighbor, later testified that Cooper, one of the gunmen, chased him out of the house after he came downstairs from checking on the wounded and dying. After failing to find any weapons, Raleigh stepped outside into the front yard, attempting to control the situation. He shooed away onlookers, threatening at least one witness by pointing his gun and warning, "You better leave unless you want me to shoot you too." Leto underscores that these actions, planting evidence, intimidating witnesses, and failing to preserve the scene or seek medical attention, were driven by the gunmen's awareness that the evidence and witnesses worked against them, casting their actions in a damning light. The next morning, after Ivan Stymack returned to the Putrich boarding house, he was arrested by Harry James and taken to the hospital. During the altercation in the yard the previous day, Ivan Kalin had been struck in the head several times with a billy club, leaving him disoriented. Despite his injuries, Kalin managed to escape into the boarding house, where he found himself caught in the crossfire as strikebreakers and guards fired from inside and outside the building. Once the gunfire subsided, Kalin stepped outside and witnessed the nearly lifeless Stephen Putrich being carried away. Some of the attackers recognized Kalin as one of their targets and immediately seized him. Since they lacked a warrant and were not law enforcement officers, the strikebreakers took Kalin to the mining company office and ordered him to wait while they decided what to do. According to Stephen Leto, when the men took Kalin into custody, he was not being arrested, he was being kidnapped. The strikebreakers dragged Kalin into the mine office, assuming that they could then get him handed over to a friendly law enforcement officer with the help of mine managers. While Kalin sat in the office waiting to see where he would be dragged next, a deputy came by and spit on him. After about an hour and a half, Kalin was transported to Houghton in an attempt to have him formally arrested. No effort was made to address his injuries, despite the repeated blows to his head with clubs and fists. The following day, trammer boss Humphrey Quick filed a formal complaint, leading to warrants being issued for the arrest of Kalin and Stymack. However, the warrants were issued only after Kalin had already been taken into custody. It remains unclear whether Stymack's warrant was issued before or after he was detained, but in either case, the arrest of both men were described as highly irregular and likely illegal. Houghton County Prosecutor Anthony Lucas visited the Putrich boarding house, observing the aftermath of the violent incident. He immediately classified the shootings as murders and called the sheriff, James A. Cruz, to arrest the 6 men responsible for the assault on Kalin and Stymack. Sheriff Cruz, however, refused to comply and instead arrested Kalin. Adding to the injustice, the very men Lucas sought to arrest for the shootings were used as key witnesses against Kalin. The arrest warrants for Kalin and Stymack were officially dated August 15, 1913, but the timeline of events remains ambiguous. Stymack, who had sustained a gunshot wound, was taken to the hospital by Harry James for medical treatment during this period, though the circumstances surrounding his detention were equally irregular. On Saturday, August 15th, a hearing was held where officials questioned members of the Putrich household, including Joseph Putrich, Albert Tejan, Josephine Grubtick, Ivan Kalin's 18-year-old son Slav, 3 unnamed neighbors, and the strikebreakers, Quick, Cooper, Raleigh, James, and Pilkington Horn. Judge Alfred J. Murphy, Houghton County Sheriff James A. Cruz, and Houghton County Prosecutor Anthony Lucas launched independent investigations into the massacre. After visiting the scene and interviewing witnesses, Lucas declared the shooting a senseless and unjustifiable act of murder. He demanded that Cruz strip the 2 deputies and 4 Waddell agents of their authority and arrest them. Describing the incident as a shameful affair that was entirely uncalled for, Lucas urged accountability. However, Cruz questioned Lucas's jurisdiction and stated he would seek legal counsel before acting on the request. On Sunday, August 16th, at 11 a.m., a special funeral train departed from the Copper Range Depot in Painesdale, picking up mourners and stopping in South Range, Atlantic Mine, Houghton, Hancock, Dollar Bay, Hubbell, and Lake Linden. Upon reaching Red Jacket, the passengers joined thousands of others in the procession to honor the fallen. The gathering began at the Palestra in the early afternoon before proceeding to a funeral service led by Father Meaden at the Croatian Roman Catholic Church of St. John the Baptist. The Finnish Hamu Band led the procession to Lakeview Cemetery, 2 miles away, as participants carried evergreen boughs, wreaths, and bouquets of wildflowers. The solemn funeral became a powerful demonstration of unity among the strikers, with approximately 5,000 participants. After the religious ceremonies, strike leaders delivered impassioned speeches at the graveside. Joseph Cannon, a prominent WFM organizer, condemned the killings as retaliation for the workers' efforts to bargain collectively. Cannon accused Governor Woodbridge N. Ferris of being complicit in the violence, labeling him an accessory before the fact of this lamentable double murder. He denounced Sheriff Cruz, stating, "His hands dripped with blood," and criticized the corporation-controlled press for spreading falsehoods to justify the killings. Unfortunately, there isn't any more information on Krystlynn or Stymack. Thomas Williamson, born on April 23, 1831, in Mackinac Township, Illinois, was one of 5 children in the wealthy household of farmer Reuben W. Williamson. Thomas described his father as a stern figure who imposed a strong work ethic on him from an early age. At just 10 years old, he began engaging in theft, committing numerous acts around Tazewell County, and frequently spending his evenings in Oakdale, where his reputation as a troublemaker grew. His criminal attempts escalated at the age of 13 when he tried to rob a store in Peking, resulting in his arrest and brief incarceration in the local penitentiary. However, he was acquitted after a trial several weeks later. In the ensuing years, Thomas alternated between working for his father and uncle, with intermittent spells of incarceration, including a week in jail for horse theft in Centralia. Following his release, seeking new direction, he joined the Union Army, believing that military life might offer a positive change. He enlisted in the 7th Illinois Infantry Regiment and spent most of his service stationed at Bald Knob. Upon an honorable discharge, he returned to Mackinac Township, engaging in various odd jobs that yielded substantial profits. Eventually, he enlisted in the 108th Illinois Infantry Regiment, deployed to Tennessee. During this time, he resumed his thieving ways, stealing small items such as pocket watches from fellow soldiers. According to his own account, he participated in significant battles like the Siege of Vicksburg, Siege of Corinth, the Red River Battle, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Battle of Lookout Mountain, and numerous others. Following the war's end, he returned to Illinois. In 1868, Williamson, accompanied by his brother-in-law Shivler and a friend named Harkett, made their way to the residence of an elderly German man named August Koch in Delavan, intending to spend the evening playing cards together. As the night wore on and alcohol flowed freely, a dispute erupted between the trio and Koch, who accused them of cheating. In response, with the assistance of Shivler and Harkett, Williamson ended up killing Koch, and together they concealed the body beneath the house they were in. Shortly after, Shivler and Harkett were apprehended. Thomas managed to evade capture for a brief period before eventually being caught in Springfield. All 3 men received death sentences, yet a last-minute intervention by his attorney led then-Governor Richard J. Oglesby to commute their sentences. Williamson served 11 years in prison, diligently working overtime to earn money. He was released on April 1, 1879, only to return to Mackinac Township to discover his father had passed away. After working for Mr. Orndorff, he relocated to Missouri, where he traveled around Missouri and nearby Kansas, engaging in various minor criminal activities. In January 1877, Williamson wed 57-year-old Suzanne Kirk in Centralia, Missouri. Despite their contentment as a couple, poverty compelled them to wander Missouri, selling goods to whoever showed interest. The following year, they encountered Dr. Middleton, who suggested they head to Sedalia, where the mayor, Cole Crawford, might provide suitable work. By the fall of 1889, they resided in a log cabin 6 miles outside of Sedalia, but later vacated it around September or October. While Williamson sought employment in the city through odd jobs, his wife mysteriously disappeared. When asked about her whereabouts, Thomas claimed she had gone to visit relatives in Calhoun, Illinois, and would return soon. Her prolonged absence led Williamson to assert that she had died of renal colic during her stay in Illinois. Unable to afford the transportation of her remains, he arranged for her burial there. Though some found his story dubious, no further inquiry was made, and the matter was soon forgotten. The only person who seemed to take notice was Farmer Dan Closier, the new owner of the log cabin, to whom Williamson explicitly mentioned not to disturb a specific spot on the property, citing he had planted parsnip there. At a later point, Williamson became associated with the local Salvation Army branch, finding shelter there. Being unemployed, he sought work around town and eventually secured a position as a farmhand on the Moore's farm owned by 59-year-old Jefferson Moore and his 29-year-old son, Charles. In the early days of May 1890, Charles suddenly went missing, but little attention was given to his disappearance. A week passed, during which Jeff purchased rails from a neighbor, John Brennick, promising prompt payment. When Jeff failed to show up on the agreed date, Brennick visited the Moore farm only to find Jeff absent. Williamson was on the premises, and when questioned about Jeff's whereabouts, he claimed ignorance. This response raised suspicion among Brennick and other neighbors, especially considering that the day before, Thomas had been observed transporting soil to the house for undisclosed reasons. Concern grew, leading to the organization of a search party to locate Jeff Moore. Meanwhile, local police received alerts about an elderly man's suicide attempt in Citrus Park having consumed a fatal dose of strychnine. 4 officers rushed to the park, discovering Thomas Williamson barely alive on the ground. He was swiftly taken to the Salvation Army barracks, where he received antidotes and eventually recovered. When questioned about his suicide attempt, he expressed being tired of living and yearned to meet God. Shortly after his suicide attempt, during the search on the Moore farm, Jeff's body was unearthed buried in the cellar. Later that day, Charles's body was also discovered buried in one of his father's fields. Both men had suffered fatal blows to their skulls with an axe. Locals swiftly connected the dots, pointing fingers at Williamson for the crime. He was promptly arrested and held in the county jail to shield him from potential lynching. Resurfacing rumors about his wife's death prompted Dan Closier and another neighbor to investigate the log cabin and excavate the spot forbidden by Williamson. There, they uncovered the preserved remains of Susan, found curled up in the fetal position. Her body was taken to the coroner, and upon suspicion of a suspicious demise, further inquiries were made in town. The subsequent inquest led the jury to unanimously conclude that all 3 victims had fallen prey to Thomas Williamson's hands. He was soon to stand trial for the killings. While awaiting trial, Williamson confessed to killing the Moores, but asserted he had been paid $300 to commit the act. Responding to these allegations, Jeff Moore's ex-wife and son, William, faced arrest but were later released due to insufficient evidence. Preceding his trial, Williamson altered his stance, asserting that he was only an accomplice involved in burying the bodies and intended to plead guilty to that charge, not to the murders. On November 30th, 1890, Thomas was formally indicted for the murders of Jeff and Charles Moore. Speaking to reporters, he appeared indifferent, admitting he hadn't read the indictment, hinting at hopes for an acquittal on all charges. Justice Ryland ordered no other trials in Pettis County while Williamson's trial was ongoing due to its high-profile nature. Following a 2-week trial, the jury found Thomas Andrew Williamson guilty, and Justice Ryland sentenced him to death. An immediate appeal was made to the Supreme Court of Missouri, which rejected further appeals from the prisoner. Williamson remained unaffected upon hearing the verdict. His attorney appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, seeking the reversal of the Pettis County verdict and a new trial. The appeal was granted, temporarily postponing Williamson's execution as per standard procedures. On June 30th, the Supreme Court upheld Williamson's guilt, sentencing him to hang on October 31st. When questioned by reporters about the decision, Williamson appeared unperturbed, expressing his readiness to face his fate and meet his maker. On October 22nd, he wrote to Governor David R. Francis, requesting a public hanging. On the day of his execution, moments before 10 o'clock, Thomas Williamson ascended the scaffold, admitting to his crimes to those present. His final words were reportedly, "I should have been hanged 30 years ago." The noose was tightened, the black hat placed over his head, and before pulling the lever, the sheriff wished for God's mercy on Williamson's soul. The trapdoor was released, and within 16 minutes, the murderer was declared dead. With no one claiming the remains, Thomas Andrew Williamson was laid to rest in a potter's field. Sarah Reynolds, a native of Potton, Bedfordshire, entered the world in 1819. Her father, Philip Reynolds, worked as a local barber, while her mother, Anne Reynolds, stood by his side. Unfortunately, Sarah's idyllic childhood took a tragic turn at the tender age of 7 when her father passed away. Subsequently, her mother sought companionship with several suitors. As Sarah blossomed into a young woman, she possessed striking features, a tall stature, captivating brown eyes, and flowing auburn locks. At the age of 19, she embarked on a marital journey with Simon Meade. Initially residing in Potton, they spent 2 blissful years together before deciding to relocate to Tadlow in 1840. Shortly after settling into their new abode, the couple joyously welcomed their son Jonah into the world. However, their happiness was short-lived as Jonah's fragile life ended tragically after a mere 7 months. To Sarah's dismay, the unexpected grief compounded when Simon Meade also passed away in October of that same year. Following the untimely demise of her first spouse, Sarah wasted no time in entering into a second marriage. In 1841, she wedded William Dasley, and together they relocated to the tranquil village of Wrestlingworth. Eager to provide a nurturing environment, Sarah extended an invitation to her stepdaughter, Anne Meade, Simon Meade's daughter, urging her to join the household. However, William strongly objected to the idea, and in response, he turned to the destructive solace of excessive drinking, subjecting his wife to physical abuse. In her distress, Sarah confided in a confidant named William Waldock, passionately declaring that she would resort to extreme measures against any man who dared lay a hand on her. As William Dasley's health declined, both Sarah and her stepdaughter dutifully cared for him. Dr. Sandell, the local physician, prescribed medication that exhibited signs of improvement while under the watchful eyes of Anne Meade. Unbeknownst to Anne, Sarah surreptitiously concocted her own pills for her ailing husband. Initially, Meade failed to recognize any cause for concern. However, when William adamantly refused to ingest the newly introduced pills, Anne ingested one herself to prove their harmlessness. Unbeknownst to her, Sarah had deliberately laced these pills with arsenic. Upon witnessing Anne's ingestion, Sarah reprimanded her for the reckless act. Consequently, Anne fell gravely ill and experienced symptoms akin to those of William, including severe vomiting and abdominal pain. Eventually succumbing to his wife's lethal medication, William tragically passed away on October 30th, 1842. The suspicious circumstances surrounding the deaths of Sarah's 2 husbands and her son raised significant concerns. A thorough examination of William Dasley's remains revealed the presence of arsenic, triggering suspicions against Sarah. Subsequently, an arrest warrant was issued for Dasley, prompting her to flee to the bustling city of London in a bid to evade justice. Following her discovery in London by Superintendent Blunden of Biggleswade Police, Dasley vehemently maintained her innocence and vehemently denied any involvement in the alleged crimes. She adamantly asserted her ignorance regarding poisonings, adamantly stating that she never possessed or procured any poisonous substances. Nevertheless, she was apprehended and transported back to Bedford, where she awaited her trial. The suspicious circumstances surrounding William Dasley's demise had already sparked doubts concerning the death of Jonah and Simon Meade. Consequently, their bodies were exhumed for further investigation. Traces of arsenic were indeed detected in Jonah's remains, but the advanced state of decomposition rendered Simon's body unsuitable for testing. On March 24, 1843, Sarah Dasley was committed to Bedford Jail, where she anticipated her impending trial. During her time in confinement, she dedicated herself to devising various defenses, including theories suggesting that William had poisoned himself or that he was responsible for the poisoning of Jonah and Simon. In retaliation, she claimed to have administered arsenic to William as a form of revenge for his alleged atrocities against her family. Subsequently, on July 22, 1843, Sarah Dasley stood trial for the murder of William Dasley at the Bedfordshire Court. While she was not formally charged with the murder of her son Jonah, the case remained open as a potential avenue should the initial charges against her fail. The chemist from whom she had acquired arsenic provided incriminating testimony, as did Anne Meade and neighbor Miss Carver, who recounted what they had witnessed, including the pill-making activities. William Waldock also testified against Dasley, recounting her statement regarding her willingness to kill any man who raised a hand against her, citing alleged instances of abuse from William Dasley. The Marsh test, employed to detect the presence of arsenic in William Dasley's body, served as crucial forensic evidence against Sarah Dasley. Astonishingly, it took the jury a mere 30 minutes to reach a verdict, finding Dasley guilty of the murder of her second husband. Judge Baron Alderson sentenced Sarah Dasley to death by hanging. She was executed August 5, 1843, at Bedford Jail, where she was the only woman to be publicly hanged. Thousands of people came to watch the execution, and she became known as the Potton Poisoner. Stephen D. Richards was born on March 18, 1856, in Wheeling, West Virginia. He grew up with 5 sisters and 1 brother. When he was 6 years old, his family moved to Ohio, first to Monroe County and then to Noble County. Richard's mother was a devout Methodist, while his father, a farmer, did not profess any religious beliefs. On September 16, 1871, his mother passed away under mysterious circumstances. A few years later, at the age of 20, Richards became engaged to Anna Milhorn, with whom he maintained a correspondence during his later travels, even up to his final arrest. During this time, he also encountered individuals engaged in questionable activities and began passing counterfeit bills that he claimed to have obtained through a contact in New York. In February of 1876, he left Mount Pleasant with aspirations of finding fame and fortune out west. Richards initially resided in Iowa, working on farms in Burlington and Morning Sun. He later secured a position as an attendant at the Iowa Lunatic Asylum in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, where he was responsible for burying the deceased patients. His time at the asylum, as reported by the New York Times, had a profound impact on him, shaping his perspective on humanity. Although he denied witnessing any abuse of the patients, he admitted that handling and disposing of the deceased patients led him to become desensitized, viewing people as little more than bodies. In October of 1876, Richards left the asylum and began wandering through the Midwest, taking on sporadic employment and occasionally associating with train robbers. He briefly stayed in Kansas City before moving on to Nebraska, passing through towns like Hastings before settling in Kearney for a few weeks. During his stay in Kearney, he claimed to have been involved in numerous gunfights, where he asserted that he shot each individual involved, though he was unsure of their outcome. Throughout this period, he adopted the alias William Hudson, one of several false names he would use in his lifetime. In a confession penned following his final apprehension, Stephen D. Richards admitted to the slaying of 4 individuals during his travels through Nebraska and Iowa in 1876 and 1877. His first recorded murder occurred in late 1876, approximately 2 weeks after he arrived in Kearney, Nebraska. During a chance encounter near Dobbytown, Richards and another traveler decided to camp for the night. They engaged in a card game, with Richards emerging as the dominant winner, amassing most of his companions' money. However, as they resumed their journey towards Kearney the next morning, the other man demanded the return of his money, growing increasingly hostile when Richards refused. In response, Richard fatally shot him above the left eye, and upon confirming the man's demise, disposed of the body in the Platte River. Several days later, while continuing his journey to Kearney, Richards crossed paths with another man approximately 15 miles from a location known as Walker's Ranch. The traveler had seen Richards in the company of the man he had previously killed, and he inquired about the fate of his friend. Richards, in a bid to avoid implicating himself, initially denied any knowledge of the deceased man. However, the persistent questioning by the deceased man's friend left Richard increasingly uneasy. Fearing that the man possessed knowledge of Richard's association with the murder victim, he decided to eliminate him to safeguard his secret. When the stranger turned his back, Richard shot him in the back of the head, ending his life. Richards concealed the body and sold the man's horse in a nearby town before continuing his journey. Before reaching Kearney, Richards halted at the residence of Jasper Harrelson, whom he described as a notorious train robber. Mary, Jasper's outspoken wife, noticed blood stains on Richard's shirt. In a casual response, Richards joked that the blood must have come from the men he had killed, bringing their conversation to an end. Later on, Richards ventured to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he used counterfeit currency to purchase a horse and buggy from an unidentified seller. When the seller discovered the counterfeit money, he confronted Richards, demanding genuine payment or the return of his horse and buggy. Richards rejected both demands and in response shot the seller. He then buried the victim and left the area. In March 1877, Richards, accompanied by a young man named George, embarked on horseback from Grand Island, Nebraska, towards Kearney. They camped between Lowell and Kearney along the Platte River. An early morning dispute erupted when Richards attempted to rouse George, who was angered by the early awakening and began hurling insults at Richards. Their argument escalated, leading to George brandishing his revolver and making threats. Richards, fearing for his life, reacted swiftly and shot George in the head with his .33 caliber pistol. It was their first major disagreement. After departing the scene, Richards reached Kearney and registered at a local hotel under the alias F.A. Hodge. During his stay, he reunited with acquaintances George Henry Johnson, Hurst, and a man known as Mr. Burns. In June 1878, while residing in Kearney, Stephen D. Richards was arrested and incarcerated on charges of larceny. Richards vehemently maintained his innocence regarding this accusation. During his time behind bars, he had a reunion with Mary L. Harrelson. Prior to Richards' arrival, Mary had been detained under suspicion of aiding her husband and another inmate, known as Underwood or Nixon, in escaping from the Kearney jail. During their shared confinement, Richard and Mary Harrelson struck a deal. She agreed to sell him the deed to her property 6 months hence for the sum of $600. Upon his release from jail, Richards embarked on a journey through various regions of Nebraska, conducting business in Hastings, Bloomington, and Grand Island, before ultimately returning to the Harrelson homestead in Kearney County on October 18, 1878. It was there that Mary Harrelson officially transferred ownership of the property to Richards, and he resided there for several weeks. Approximately a month later, Richards made the horrifying decision to take the lives of Mary Harrelson and her 3 children, 10-year-old Daisy, 4-year-old Mabel, and 2-year-old Jasper, affectionately called Jesse. In Richards' confession, he asserted that Mary Harrelson had discovered his involvement in a murder, and he feared that her talkative nature might lead authorities to uncover his presence. In an effort to silence Mary and ensure the concealment of his prior crimes, Richards resolved to commit the gruesome act of wiping out the entire Harrelson family. On November 3, 1878, Richards arose in the early morning, joined by another man named Brown, who had been staying at the Harrelson residence. Brown left to tend to the horses and carry out farm chores. Seizing the opportunity, Richards procured a spade and dug a pit, then stealthily re-entered the house and brutally murdered Mary, Daisy, Mabel, and Jesse using an axe. Some accounts suggested that Mary and one of the children met their tragic end with a smoothing iron, while the others suffered physical assaults. Nevertheless, Richards refuted these alternative versions of events, affirming that he had taken the lives of the family while they were asleep. Most of them had perished after the initial series of blows, with the exception of Daisy, who endured agonizing pain for some time. Following the heinous act, Richards purportedly cleaned the blood from the floor and himself. He then proceeded to enjoy a calm breakfast. Subsequently, he carried the lifeless bodies out of the house and interred them in the pit that he had previously dug nearby. When questioned about the Harrelson family's whereabouts, Richards informed several people that they had departed in the company of Brown, with no knowledge of their expected return. It wasn't until December 11th that the bodies of Mary Harrelson and her children were discovered. Some reports indicated that they were concealed beneath a haystack, contrary to Richards' later claims that he had buried them. On December 9, 1878, Stephen D. Richards agreed to assist his neighbor, a 26-year-old immigrant from Sweden named Peter Anderson, with some tasks on Anderson's property. It was reported by the Columbus Journal that Richards used the alias Dick Richardson while working for Anderson. However, on that same day, December 9th, Anderson fell ill after consuming a meal that Richards had prepared for him. This led Anderson to harbor suspicion that Richards had intentionally poisoned him. Troubled by these thoughts, Anderson shared his concerns with the neighboring resident. The following day, Anderson confronted Richards about his suspicions, resulting in a physical altercation between the two men. The exact details of Anderson's demise differ in contemporary newspaper accounts. Some sources suggest Richards beat Anderson to death with a hammer or hatchet, while others claim that he shot him. Regardless of the method used, Anderson's lifeless body was later discovered concealed in the cellar of his own home, buried beneath a heap of coal. Richards vehemently denied any involvement in poisoning Anderson, asserting that such a method did not align with his typical actions. Instead, he contended that Anderson had attacked him with a knife and he had acted in self-defense. Following the murder of Peter Anderson, Stephen D. Richards made a hasty decision to flee Kearney. He anticipated the concealed bodies would soon be discovered, prompting his departure. As evening descended, Richards was in the midst of hitching up Anderson's horses and making preparations to depart when some of Anderson's concerned neighbors arrived at the scene. They had grown suspicious of Anderson's absence and questioned Richards about it. In response, he informed them that Anderson was inside the house. As Anderson's neighbors ventured into the dwelling, Richards quickly made his escape on horseback, riding towards Bloomington. His journey took him eastward, involving a combination of travel by horse, train, and foot. He passed through Omaha and Chicago, all while evading pursuit. During his time on the run, Richards crossed paths with Jasper Harrelson and another fugitive who had escaped custody. Together, they embarked on a journey that led them through Wheeling, West Virginia, and into Ohio, traversing the town of Bridgeport before reaching Richards' hometown of Mount Pleasant. On December 16, 1878, Nebraska Governor Silas Garber issued an arrest warrant for Richards and offered a $200 reward for his capture and subsequent conviction. Most historical records indicate that on December 20, 1878, shortly after Stephen D. Richards had arrived in Mount Pleasant, he attended a ballroom dance in the company of two unidentified women. It was a time when wanted posters bearing Richards' likeness had been widely distributed throughout the town. Constable McGrew, having recognized Richards from the wanted poster, took swift action. He enlisted the assistance of a penitentiary guard named Folge, both armed with shotguns, and set out to apprehend Richards. They encountered him walking through a field just outside of town, accompanied by two women. Richards, unarmed and perceiving their approach, quickly surrendered. Richards later recounted that upon spotting the approaching officers, he had initially contemplated on a confrontation and instructed the women to return to town. However, when the women refused to leave, he decided to surrender, sparing any violence. In his own words, Richards expressed that had the women departed, it might have resulted in a different outcome. He further explained that his plan, had he escaped, was to make his way to Nebraska, as he believed it to be the last place anyone would think to look for him. Following his arrest, Richards was initially incarcerated in Steubenville, Ohio. During his time there, he penned 2 articles for the local newspaper, confessing to 9 murders committed over a span of 3 years. Sheriff David Anderson of Buffalo County, Nebraska, and Sheriff Martin of Kearney County, both of whom had pursued Richards to Ohio, facilitated his return to Nebraska. Shortly before his trial, Richards anticipated his conviction and subsequent execution for his crimes. He was transferred to a jail in Omaha on December 28th and then transported to Kearney by train. On December 30th, a large agitated crowd gathered outside the Kearney jail, prompting authorities to take extra precautions to ensure Richards' safety and their own. While being moved to the depot, Richards was struck by the size of the crowd and inquired whether the entire town had turned out to witness his journey. Thankfully, the crowd eventually dispersed without any further incidents during his stay in Kearney. Richards' trial commenced on January 16, 1879, in Minden, Nebraska, under the jurisdiction of Judge William Gasling. District Attorney Schofield led the prosecution, while Richards' defense was in the capable hands of lawyer Savage. The charges against Richard included 2 indictments for first-degree murder, one for the slaying of the Harrelson family and the other for the death of Peter Anderson. Richards entered a plea of not guilty, contending that he had acted in self-defense when he killed Anderson. In support of their case, the prosecution summoned 7 witnesses to testify, all providing accounts of the condition in which Anderson's body was discovered. Subsequently, Richards was called to the stand to give his testimony. Under questioning from Schofield, he admitted to causing Anderson's death with a hammer, emphasizing that he had done so in self-defense. Richards explained that, despite repeated warnings to the contrary, Anderson had attempted to reach for a nearby hatchet. As evidence, the prosecution introduced the hammer used in the killing, which Richards acknowledged as the murder weapon. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict of guilty for the murders of the Harrelson family and Anderson. Richards received a death sentence by hanging, with his execution scheduled for April 26, 1879. Throughout the proceedings and his conviction, Richards maintained a demeanor described as cheerful and indifferent by onlookers. Following Richards' conviction, Sheriff Martin made the unusual decision to open up the execution in Minden to the public, despite apprehensions about a potentially unruly and large crowd. To mitigate the risk of a riot, an enclosure was constructed around the gallows to separate the expected spectators from Richards. However, admission tickets to the restricted area were sold, and Richards was permitted to invite individuals. Estimates of the number of spectators presented at the execution varied significantly, ranging from 2,000 to 25,000 individuals. At precisely 1 p.m., Richards was led to the gallows by Sheriff Martin and his deputy, which temporarily calmed the crowd. Upon ascending the gallows, Richards launched into a fervent defense of his actions. He reiterated his claims that he had acted in self-defense in Anderson's case and denied any involvement in the Harrelson family murders. Richards asserted that he had been wrongfully convicted. He then declared that he had found solace in religion, having made peace with God and placing his faith in Christ. Richards' final words were reported as, "Jesus be with me now." Reverend W. Sanford G., who presided over the execution, expressed hope that Richards' professions of religious redemption were sincere, but admitted that they might not have been. At 1:15 p.m. on April 26, 1879, Richards was hanged, a process that the St. Louis Globe-Democrat claimed took 15 minutes for him to succumb to. Richards thus became the first person to be executed in Nebraska since its incorporation into the United States in 1867. Shortly after his execution, a photographer managed to capture an image of Richards' lifeless body positioned inside a coffin.